I think because the Ukrainian people are enduring so much, they tend to grasp at any sort of change as a possible hope for end.
Mhm. You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, and then later on the pod, we sat down with a long-term friend of ours, Paul Kroeger. Paul is currently working and living in Ukraine. He's got an incredible perspective on what is going on right now in Ukraine, as well as reflections upon what happened in the White House last Friday. It is a remarkable conversation that you are not want to miss. So stay tuned. It's going to be a great pod. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I am well. How about you?
Well, the world's on fire, and I'm just sitting here with a spray bottle. How about you?
Well, not a spray bottle, but yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, so everything's on fire, I feel like. And
Yeah.
now we have also entered into Lent,
Oh, it's a double whammy for
just
you.
another dark time. So, yeah, not feeling so good.
Yeah, lots going on in the news. We're going to talk about that later on in the pod. But yes, we are standing at the threshold of Lent.
Which I have a question about that.
Okay.
Because, you and I didn't grow up observing Lent.
No, we
But-
grew up Baptist.
Right. We've since embraced that.
Not just Baptist, Southern Baptist.
Right. So in our adult years, we have embraced,
Yeah.
well, I have reluctantly embraced it.
I, on the other hand, absolutely love Lent.
Right. But I have a question. If we didn't get to celebrate Mardi Gras and Fat Tuesday, are we obligated to Lent?
Well, I don't know. We may have to go to the higher ups for that
I may have
question.
to ask that question because due to like scheduling and things, we didn't get to do anything to celebrate Mardi Gras or Fat Tuesday. Like there was no jazz music, there was no king cake, there was no nothing in our lives. So I'm feeling a little jilted.
Yeah, no beads, nothing associated with it.
Yes. So anyways, it doesn't feel quite right. But yes, so we're embarking upon Lent.
Absolutely. So this last Wednesday commemorated the beginning of Lent with Ash Wednesday. You already mentioned Fat Tuesday, but that led right into Ash Wednesday as this 40-day journey that we begin together towards Easter is now underway. So really excited about this time because it is very meaningful for me. Traditionally, you're supposed to give something up for Lent. I'm going to go ahead and assume by your comments already, you're not giving anything up this year.
You know me. I'm terrible at New Year's resolutions and Lent. I've just historically said no because it just sets myself up for failure. And I'm generally just, feeling pretty down on my accomplishments anyway. So why set myself up for
Well,
failure?
Missy, I've got some good news for you about Lent. And that is, personally, I think Lent is less about giving something up.
Right. In my mind, it was always you take something that you're near and dear to your heart and that you love, like chocolate per se, and then you have to give that up for 40 days, which that sounds terrible.
Oh, who are we kidding? You're talking about tequila or Diet
Okay.
Coke.
Hey now. Hey now.
Oh,
Let's not take it too far.
that was very personal. Sorry about that.
Right, but that's just what, again, growing up, that was always what I knew of friends who observed Lent is that you had to give up something that was going to hurt, so to speak.
Right. And for me, and as I read the gospel, especially the preparation of Jesus prior to his ministry and then prior to his entering into Jerusalem for the final time, to me, it's less about giving things up and more about self-denial, but not self-denial for the fact of just giving something material up, but it's the idea of preparing oneself for the journey ahead. And so when we think about Jesus before he set out on his 3-year ministry, He went into the wilderness to get his mind right, to get his heart right, to get his soul right, to clear himself for what lies ahead.
Mhm.
And we also think about the days leading up to his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And I've often said, time and time again, that this time period right before he enters into Jerusalem, eventually getting crucified, and then, for those of us who, hold the resurrection dear to our hearts, before that event, it was this preparation to get his mind right for what he was about to experience.
Mhm.
And for me, especially this year, Missy, these 40 days are significant
How so?
because I am choosing not to give anything up material wise, but to use a time each and every day to at least prepare myself for the journey ahead. Because as you have already mentioned in the opening, these are some dark days. These are some difficult days. And there's a lot on our plates right now. Anybody who stays up with the news is being inundated with all these stories, and a lot of them are negative and difficult and hard to read.
Well, a
And
lot of
to understand,
people that are being directly affected by
100%.
decisions that are being made.
100%. And so I am choosing this Lent not to give something up material wise, but choosing to spend some time each and every day during this season preparing myself for what lies ahead. And I think that is going to help me in the future because of the journey that we are facing together. And so that's what I'm choosing to do this Lent.
So preparing for Friday,
Mm-hmm.
as you said, but also hopeful for Sunday.
Exactly. Absolutely. I'm so glad you said that. So we're preparing for the crucifixion of Friday, but with the anticipation of hope in Sunday is coming. And so that is what I'm trying to do during this Lenten season, because as we experience Friday, and we have to go through Friday, we have to go through the cross, we have to go through Calvary in order to get to resurrection morning and the Easter celebration. And that is what, for me at least, is helping me through these days and giving me hope for the future.
All right, I will try.
Well, I wish you the very best. And I hope that this Lenten season is meaningful to you, to our listeners, because as I said a moment ago, we need some dedicated time to prepare ourselves in order to endure what we are experiencing, but also to hope for the future. And as we talk to our guest this week, as we sat down with a dear friend of ours, Paul Kroeger, who lives in Western Ukraine, we get to hear a little bit of that distraught in his voice, but we also get to hear that hope in his voice because of the stories he shares. And so I thought our conversation really with Paul was a great opening to this Lenten season.
Right. I'm so excited for our listeners to get to hear Paul. As they'll discover in the opening of our interview, we go way back 30 years. He's somebody very near and dear to my heart from knowing him as a small child. So I'm just love seeing all that he's doing in the world and being a change maker. And I'm so excited for our listeners to get to meet him.
So Missy and I will be right back with Paul Kroeger, who is currently living and working in Ukraine.
For decades, the Festival of Homiletics has nurtured, challenged, and inspired thousands of preachers in their God-given calling. And this May, you can be part of the revival from the comfort of your own home. Live stream the sermons and lectures from our compelling speakers throughout the week, or watch the recordings at your leisure, and participate in dynamic community through our interactive platform. Please join us as we restore what has been depleted and nourish one another at the festival. Please visit www.festivalofhomiletics.com to reserve your spot today.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Paul Kroeger is a field officer based in Lviv, Ukraine, managing humanitarian projects for an NGO. He has lived in Ukraine for about 2 years. Prior to his work in Ukraine, Paul lived in Germany as an opera singer, working as a soloist at several theaters for 6 years. He holds a master's degree in international affairs from the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and degrees in music from the University of Colorado at Boulder and Southern Methodist University. Paul, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about Ukraine.
And Paul, we're excited that you're here. We've got lots to discuss, but before we get started, we do realize there is a disclaimer that you need to state before we begin. So let's go ahead and state that.
Yes, absolutely. So I just want to disclaim that I am here as a private citizen expressing my personal views. They do not necessarily reflect the views of my employer or any organization that I might be a part of.
Perfect. All right.
Okay, Paul, I'm so excited to have you on the show today.
Paul, we've got like Bono, we've got the Pope, and then Missy's got Paul Kroeger right there at the top of her guest list. So she's been looking forward to this.
Yes, let's start with my qualifier, which is we go back almost 30 years, a long time, because I used to be your nanny when you were a little,
Yes.
a wee child.
Amazing.
That is
And the only nanny I liked.
Wait, could you say it again for the folks in the back?
Wow.
You were the only nanny I liked.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's going to be on repeat right now for months ahead.
Coincidentally, I'm the only wife Mitch has liked, so I have that in common. But anyway, so yes, we go way back. We have so enjoyed just watching your career, of course, through the magic of social media and seeing you grow up and do all these amazing things in your life. So tell us how a young man like you from North Texas ends up pursuing an opera career and then working for an NGO in Ukraine. And also, does your mother know about this?
Yes, she does. So first of all, most importantly, my mom does know. She supports this. She was in the Air Force herself and took her own risks in her 30s. And she very much supports the kind of work that I'm doing in Ukraine now. I was always into music. I don't know if I was playing violin already when you knew me. Yeah. So I started playing violin around, I think, 5. And then when I was in middle school and high school, I started singing, and that was more, I guess, what my talent was. And I saw my first opera in high school, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. So you have these different languages and the costumes and all of these world cultures colliding and the opportunity to travel. And for me, I also had the opportunity to go to school on scholarship, which was definitely handy. And so I started my opera career. I was very lucky to be able to have a performance career, make my living being a singer, which was absolutely my goal. But I lived in Germany during the Syrian refugee crisis, and Putin had invaded Ukraine already and occupied Crimea and parts of the Donbass. He was supporting Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, and there were all these economic refugees coming from North Africa as well, and the rest of the Middle East, and it caused tremendous social tension in Germany at the time, and it was a huge point of discussion, and it continues to be today. I think a lot of racial politics were mixed up in that. A lot of economic politics were mixed up in that, and it got me really thinking about what are the things that I really enjoy in my career. So I lived abroad. I loved speaking foreign languages. All of the theaters I worked in had people from all over the world working in there. All of my soloist colleagues were from everywhere. And I worked in different languages, of course, as an opera singer. And eventually I realized this international affairs thing is really what I'm passionate about. And I'm very much passionate about human rights and democracy and rule of law and helping extend the opportunities that I had as an American to other people who might have to move somewhere else and be displaced to achieve that. So during the pandemic, I was fortunate to still have a soloist position where I was salaried. And so I still got paid, which was great. I was one of the few singers in the world who got a paycheck. And but I decided to come back to the US, do a Master of International Affairs degree with the goal of working for an NGO or becoming a diplomat.
Mm. Wow.
That's amazing. So give our listeners just a little glimpse into daily life. I know many of us are probably curious about how life goes on in the area that you're in.
So I live in Lviv. This is in Western Ukraine, and it's about an hour's drive from the border with Poland. So we're in Western Ukraine. I would say it's more safe. There's less stuff of interest here. It's the furthest away from the front. For comparison, I think we're about as far from the front as like Dallas is from the Mexico border. So it's not so far to the front, but even if there were some sort of breakthrough, it's not like I would suddenly be in occupied territory. But because I don't know if this is true because a lot of this is like not information that's public, but when I first moved here, I felt like we were less well defended with air defense from rockets and drones than Kyiv was, because there was less, this was less strategically important. Now I think it's a little better. So there are regular air raids, there are regular sirens, there have been people killed in Lviv by Russian airstrikes not far from my apartment since I've lived here. But life in general goes on. There are regular power outages, especially if it gets really hot or really cold. You'll go hours without power and it's scheduled and you know that this is happening, or if there's big attacks. But I also travel a lot within Ukraine, and there are many parts of Ukraine that are not like this. If you go to Kharkiv, every single time I've been there, I think there have been attacks where civilians are killed while I'm there. And I don't stay there very long because it's dangerous. Like you go do your thing and you leave. But I know people who, they're Ukrainians, they work there, they're defending or providing emergency services or whatever, and that's where they live. And every week people die. The Russians will bomb these places. They send these dumb bombs, old Soviet massive bombs with little kits that let them glide down to their targets. And so in those parts of Ukraine, life does not go on as normal. There is much more outage of power. There's a lot of death. People get used to the air raids and you just they live through it. But they know that the alternative to that would be living under Russian occupation and like guaranteed no social liberty, no civil liberties, torture, being abducted, that kind of stuff. So that's why they're still hanging on there.
Wow. Paul, I had the privilege of visiting Lviv prior to the war. It was after Russia's invasion of Crimea. And so Lviv was still kind of a bustling city, lots of activity in the shops and cafes and the parks. It was just a beautiful experience that I had. But hanging over even the bustling of the city back then was the constant presence of a potential Russian invasion after Crimea. And you had in churches these shrines of local soldiers who were on the front lines, dying for their freedom and defending their country. And I can't imagine what that's like right now. I mean, there's got to be a heaviness all the way, even in West Ukraine at this point.
Oh, absolutely. Everywhere in Ukraine, and especially, I would say, this year. I know exactly which church you're talking about. Those shrines are still there. And that is like the military church. So that's where all of the funerals for the soldiers take place. They usually, when I moved here at least, they were doing them in batches, like 3 to 4 soldiers per day, because that was the casualties just from Lviv. And every single morning, there's at least one funeral convoy that passes my apartment going from the city center to the military grave cemetery area just outside of the center of Lviv. And yeah, there's absolutely a heaviness, and it doesn't get easier. Seeing the funerals of the soldiers with all the family members and all of the Ukrainians kneeling down on the side of the road as the funeral goes past, that gets me every time, every single time. Yeah.
So, Paul, last Friday in the Oval Office of the White House, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with U.S. President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and other officials. The meeting, as the world now knows, did not go well. Trump and Vance ambush Zelensky, demanding gratitude and the right to acquire mineral rights in Ukraine. So, Paul, after last Friday, what was your immediate reaction after watching the just debacle of that meeting in the White House?
Well, first, it was really painful to hear Russian disinformation coming from America's leaders. A lot of the talking points were literally the exact talking points that the Russian foreign ministry has been using, and a lot of them were false. The accusation that Zelensky hasn't thanked the American public is false, but also it did feel like a setup to me because we know that Zelensky is going to ask for security guarantees. We know he's going to ask for more aid. And the briefing team at the State Department and the White House advisors, they're going to tell everybody, they know what Zelensky's going to ask. These things are all choreographed. Of course, there's some room for things to happen, as we saw, but none of this should have been a surprise. There was nothing coming from the Ukrainian side that was a surprising request. And I will say that in the 2 years that I've been here, that did more to damage Ukrainian morale than anything the Russians have done. Because in the rest of the world, like even if people are skeptical of American power and American motives, when it comes down to it, it seems to me that people who are fighting for freedom and democracy and sovereignty and rule of law, they ally themselves with America. And they see America as that beacon of hope. And when the American president then turns against them and starts repeating the talking points of their enemies, that's really hard to watch. And the way I kind of perceive the Ukrainians after that speech was, well, it's kind of like America after 9/11. Like they were really just kind of in shock. People told me that they couldn't sleep. People are really concerned right now because they feel like they're going to be negotiated over, and whatever other people decide will happen to their country will happen to them.
I just can't imagine. Just can't imagine.
So, and now we're hearing news, I guess, that the Trump administration is announcing it will freeze all financial aid and intelligence sharing with the Ukraine. So,
Yeah.
What would be your response to that? And is any response of the community to that adding to the stress?
So I just saw the news about stopping the intelligence sharing. I do know that stopping the military aid is expected to increase the attacks on that get through to cities. So my risk is going up. Everybody else who lives in Ukraine, our risks are going up because the US would provide Patriot systems and the ammunition for those. I mean, obviously, we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. There's a possibility that there really are serious negotiations happening behind the scenes with Russia, and that these are concessions that are being made in order to get some other concessions. And the fact is, and this is why I find international affairs so interesting, it's basically impossible to have a purely moral and good and just foreign policy. It's just not how things work. And there's always gradations. And no matter how this peace process pans out, no matter who's negotiating it, there will be some painful concessions that the Ukrainians have to make. And I think they realize that, like everybody knows that. But you have to negotiate, like if you're going to make concessions, get something for it. It's really strange for American leaders to go out and give a meeting to somebody who's a real adversary and causing trouble. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and I'm not president. But just to me, my first reaction was, that's really strange. We're giving up a lot. We're offering sanctions relief. We're talking about stopping intelligence sharing. We're repeating talking points that would be really damaging to Ukrainians, which maybe needs to happen in order to negotiate, but I'm not seeing concessions yet from Russia's side. And that's what I would really be interested to know, if that's happening behind the scenes.
Paul, that's such an interesting topic. I mean, when Zelensky was ushered out of the White House, Trump and the administration said that he would be welcome back when he was ready to negotiate for peace, which is an interesting way of framing that because, President Zelensky has been wanting peace for 3 years now. He didn't choose for a Russian invasion of his country. And so, as we think about this negotiation that is taking place, and what does it mean to have peace for Ukraine and peace for Russia? And you very eloquently kind of laid that out, that there is going to have to be some concessions from Ukraine, even though that's not ideal for them. There's going to have to be some concessions made. So let's back up a little bit and remember, or try to reflect upon, the reasons for the Russian invasion. Why in the world did Vladimir Putin invade a sovereign country, his neighbor, just west of him? What's the purpose for Russian even being there?
Part of this just comes down, in my opinion, to how autocratic regimes conduct foreign policy. In a democracy, you have to bring the people along with you. And so that it makes foreign policy a lot more complicated, even if you're trying to do a good thing. If, like, for example, helping Israel against a terrorist attack, that quickly gets very complicated. And we've seen a lot of dissension about that in the United States, for example. For autocrats, it's just the dictator and their coterie of advisors, and they decide whatever they think is a good idea. And a lot of times their advisors are too afraid to stand up to them and give them conflicting information that doesn't meet their worldview. And I think Putin has long harbored these grandiose dreams of a revitalized Soviet Union kind of thing. He considers, and Russian foreign media, Russian foreign ministry continually calls their former Soviet territories as their sphere of influence, and they think that they should have some sort of right to override the sovereignty of their neighbors. And I think it was just this megalomaniacal idea from Putin that was ultimately a really stupid idea. He's mortgaged the future of his country. This has been tremendously damaging for Russia. What have they gotten? I mean, yes, they've caused a lot of death in Ukraine. Yes, they've weakened Ukraine. But so far, they just have these wrecked cities. Everywhere they go, they just destroy it. And so, in my opinion, it was just a revisionist historical land grab and nothing more.
Yeah. And it's a land grab. I mean, what I've been researching, it seems as though Putin he has this grandiose vision of not only a former Soviet Union, but really an entire Russian empire, return to this Russian empire and influence, especially over European politics. And the acquisition or the invasion of Ukraine is part of that. There's also resources. Recently, here in the States, you've heard President Trump talk about minerals and paying back these grants that U.S. has provided for Ukraine. But Ukraine is a really rich, resource-based country. And so there's kind of that underlying element to it as well, correct?
There is. But Ukraine historically has always sort of been like a colony to its neighbors. So the part where I live was part of Austria, part of Poland. The people who ran the cities, who lived in Lviv, for example, didn't speak Ukrainian. And there were nationalist movements that tried to control their own territory. And in the East, it was Russia that controlled all of this. And they also tried to wipe out Ukrainian language. They had this, like, I think still there is this chauvinism in Russian culture that sees all of the great Russian writers and the great Russian composers and this, as if it's something special, unique to their culture that cannot be in others. And so they see Ukrainian culture as less than, and Belarusian culture as less than. And yes, Ukraine has a lot of resources. It's the largest country in Europe, if you don't count Russia. It does have minerals, but they're underdeveloped. And Ukraine has always struggled with lack of investment, especially during the Soviet Union. I mean, they would extract and do heavy industry in the East and the parts that Putin has destroyed. But what was interesting to me about the land deal or the mineral deal was that a lot of the things that the Trump administration was asking for weren't yet developed. And it wasn't clear if there was going to be any kind of US investment, which would actually be a good thing for Ukraine in order to extract those resources. So I don't know if for me, it would have been actually kind of fine if there can be a PR win for the Trump administration, that they can say, hey, look, we're getting something back out of this. And Ukraine is like, yeah, come on, like, let's just keep our freedom and our sovereignty. But as far as I'm aware, a lot of those minerals, there wasn't even any infrastructure to extract them yet.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is there's a lot of moving parts to what's going on in Ukraine, but also there's this, in addition to minerals and a land grab, but also this clash of cultural values between the West and Russia. That very autocratic, patriarchal in its mindset and the way it conducts business and the way it conducts life, versus it seems as though, especially in Western Ukraine, that Western European values are starting to make their way into Ukraine and the country is progressing. Would that be accurate?
Absolutely accurate. And ironically, Putin's invasion has really increased the number of Ukrainians who agree with Western values and want to feel more tied to the West. But let's remember the reason that the first invasion started in 2014 is because the Ukrainians kicked out their president, who was a corrupt Russian puppet, Yanukovych, because he had fraudulently been elected, and then he tried to undermine a deal that would have tied Ukraine closer to the EU. Putin didn't like that. And I think the standard Russian narrative is that the US somehow got all of these Ukrainians on the street to protest in this little, not very important to the US at the time, post-Soviet state, which is complete nonsense. The people who were protesting in Kyiv against the Russian puppets were always intellectual, like university educated young people who wanted to see a better future for their country.
So, Paul, you've now been in Ukraine for almost 2 years. What have you learned about our people?
Ukrainians are incredibly resilient. They have had a very, very tough history. I mean, if you just go back to the late 1800s, there were first stirrings of kind of this idea of a Ukrainian national identity and having their own space, just like in the rest of Europe at that time. And then they fought very hard for having their own territory during the Russian Civil War when the Soviets were taking over, or the Bolsheviks. And it was a very bloody civil war. There were Jews, there were Poles, there were Ukrainians, there were Russians, and everybody was killing each other, and it was complete chaos and horrible. Then Stalin starved millions of people to death in Holodomor, this massive man-made starvation that was supposed to break the back of the Ukrainian nation. And then they endured World War II and all of the slaughter from the Nazis, and then the slaughter from the Soviets. And then they endured the Soviet occupation. And finally, in the 90s, they became independent and endured major poverty. Their GDP collapsed like 40 to 50% in just a few years. And people didn't have salaries. There was nothing. And finally now, they have a nation that is able to sustain itself, and they're enduring this massive attack from one of the largest militaries in the world. And so what I've learned is that this is an incredibly rich culture. They really share these values that I, as an American, identify with, this idea of having the right to self-determination and the right to vote, the right to voice your opinions, to live as you wish to live without government interference. All of these values are the same things that our ancestors fought for when we created our nation. And I'm seeing the same thing happen here, but the sacrifice is heavy, the sacrifice that they make for those ideals.
I just cannot imagine being a Ukrainian at this time, and especially seeing the events unfold last Friday, hearing the news break that aid has been frozen, information sharing has been frozen. If I'm a Ukrainian, I feel like today, as I wake up, I feel like I've been abandoned by the United States. I mean, there's just really no other way to put it. Not by the American people themselves, but by this particular administration, because it happens so quickly and so swiftly overnight, and it boils down to the Trump administration taking over power here in the U.S. and then implementing these terrible, terrible policies towards Ukraine. So our heart goes out to the Ukrainian people. We are continuing to pray for them, wish them the very best, and hopefully maybe public opinion here in the States, because Ukrainians still have a lot of support here in the United States, and people trying to really advocate on their behalf in Washington, D.C. for more aid and for better relationships with Ukraine. So, with all of this going on, Paul, I wrote an article last week prior to Friday's events, and then Friday's events unfolded. And it really had to do with this change in foreign policy from the Trump administration. And there appears to be this new admiration by the United States towards Russia and China. We saw this in the first Trump administration. We're seeing it to even a greater extent in the second Trump administration. So, what are you hearing on the ground in Ukraine? Are Ukrainian citizens and leaders really worried about, and I hate to use this phrase, but this new world order that is emerging between three superpowers, Russia, the US, and China?
Yes, of course. I will say, ironically, I think because the Ukrainian people are enduring so much, they tend to grasp at any sort of change as a possible hope for end. So, for example, when they got the F-16, I remember a lot of people thinking like, well, this will be it.
Yeah.
This is going to change things. But no, I mean, it helped. Air defense got better, but that was, and when Trump got elected, there were a lot of Ukrainians who were actually very upset with the Biden administration because they felt that they were being kept on life support, but not enough to actually do anything. And I think some people thought, okay, Trump will come in. He's one of these like big, strong guys. He can go toe to toe with Putin and be like, make a deal or else I'll, doubly arm Ukraine. And there was hope that this could be like the end of the war, even if it's a negotiated peace, that it's going to be somehow better and we'll get. But this is not how things have turned out. I'm not sure if Ukrainians see America as part of like a triumvirate with Russia and China yet. But there's certainly a change. And I think there's two parts that I noticed. I think there's two things going on. One is the traditional isolationism versus internationalism debate that we've had since Jefferson and Adams.
Right.
So that's a big thing. And the president has the right to, absolutely, and the American people have the right to decide, okay, we want to be isolationist. That's completely valid foreign policy. And President Trump thinks that we need to be more isolationist. But the thing that I'm a little more concerned about and was very surprising to me actually was this sort of amorality in foreign policy. This idea that like it doesn't really matter whether what we're doing aligns so much with American values. We're talking about peace. Okay, I guess that's the big thing. They try to frame it like people who want to support Ukraine want to continue war. But for me, I don't see a peace deal. Russia has never said like, okay, here's the peace deal. This is what we want. And so I think in Ukraine, they do absolutely sense on the ground, even regular people are very attuned to what the language is coming out of the White House and from the State Department. And they do see a drastic change in the language. And they're often hearing things about their elected leaders that they do not agree with or appreciate. And that's been hard for them, for sure.
Yeah, I just can't imagine to hear echoes of Putin coming from the U.S. president's mouth. And I'm sitting there in Ukraine as a Ukrainian citizen. It's got to be just really mesmerizing is probably the wrong word, but surprising to hear the U.S. president echo the words that you could hear from Vladimir Putin. I mean, just really remarkable. So that leads me to my final question, Paul, and feel free not to answer this, but I feel like I need to answer it. And I want to ask it on a scale, and that is whether the American president, Donald Trump, is an asset for President Vladimir Putin. And anywhere on the scale from unwitting fool to political operative, it seems as though at every chance that President Trump gets, he is expressing admiration for President Putin to the extent of even mimicking his own words when it comes to foreign policy in regards to Ukraine. This has got to be a windfall for Putin having Trump back into the White House. So is that something American citizens should be deeply concerned about, that Putin is using an American president for his advantage?
Well, I think going back to what I said before, that it seems like maybe if it's not just a negotiating tactic, there could be like a turn towards an amorality in how the administration conducts foreign policy. What I was saying before, though, about how autocrats do this and they don't care about the morality, in America, we really do. And we've seen Americans come out for Vietnam, for the Iraq War, for Obama's drone program, for our aid to Israel, or whatever. There's anything. Americans come out and they protest and they vote on these issues. Like, they really do care about what we're doing, who we're aligning ourselves with, and they don't want their country associated with something they don't believe in. So I think we'll have to see. I think it's a little too early to see how the American people respond, and maybe the midterms will be a good way to tell what they think. As to whether Russia has an asset in Trump, I will say the Russian Foreign Ministry and Russian state TV have been extremely satisfied this last week. It's interesting because the propaganda machine went from the standard, like, America's the boogeyman, they're doing everything, like it's all their master plan, to, oh, America is now our friend and we're going to dismantle the EU together. I don't know if, obviously, if who's, a Russian asset, but
Right.
I will say that it is kind of shocking. Some of the political appointees in the administration, I think, would have trouble getting a security clearance if they were lower level government officials. Like, if they applied to the FBI, if they applied to the CIA,
Yeah.
or to the State Department, and they had some of the connections that they had, I'm guessing it would be maybe a problem to get a security clearance, but we'll have to see. I mean, and again, just as kind of a
Right.
speaking to the other side,
Sure.
it is a negotiating tactic in
Sure.
diplomacy to butter up your opponent and try to find common language. We see other people doing it to US leaders all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a possibility that this all is part of some sort of strategy that the Trump administration has to reach a deal. But I just wish that we could tone down the harsh language on Ukraine and at least not attack, the Ukrainian president,
Right.
specifically, who is democratically elected by the Ukrainian people and enjoys majority support in all the opinion polls. That would be nice.
Yeah.
But we'll have to see how things pan out. And I'm very, very curious to see whether Americans continue to demonstrate on behalf of Ukraine, and whether there's the will to continue supporting Ukraine in the American public, even though Ukraine is so far away from everything in their lives.
Well said. Well, before I hand it over to Missy for our very last question, what can Americans do to help show their support for Ukraine, both in a public manner, but also in an advocacy manner? As a U.S. citizen living in Ukraine, working with Ukrainians, supporting what they're doing over there and defending themselves, what can we do stateside to express that same support?
Well, one thing that I think actually really does work, if enough people do it, is write your representatives and your senators. I've certainly done it at certain points. There are definitely Republicans out there who have to, it's tough for them to go against their leadership. And if there are enough voters out there saying, like, no, this is not the kind of foreign policy that we want, that gives them a little bit more of a backup for, yeah, this is why I'm going to vote the way I do. The other thing that you can do is donate, especially now that we're stopping our aid from the government. One great resource is United 24. That's President Zelensky's thing, and it goes directly to the relevant ministries, and you can choose whether you want your aid to go for defense or humanitarian aid or rebuilding or demining. There's tons of different things there, and it goes directly to the relevant ministry. But I think in general, if you are just speaking, when you hear some disinformation like that Zelensky is a dictator, correct that. That's not actually true. And the Ukrainian people, in their opinion polls, the most recent one that I saw was from February, and it showed 57% of Ukrainians still support President Zelensky. And they consistently also say that they don't want elections because it's constitutionally banned during war, and it's just an opportunity to divide them.
Right.
And so if you can just speak to your friends when you get some sort of Russian disinformation, if you just say like, well, that's actually not true, that can also help, because part of what the effect here is not just that the support is going away, it's also this kind of hostility towards the Ukrainian people that to me is very sad.
Well said. Well, Paul Kroeger, thank you so much for joining us this week on Good Faith Weekly. Paul is working for an NGO in Lviv, Ukraine. Been there 2 years, a dear friend of ours, just full of information as you were able to just ascertain. It's been a joy talking to you, Paul. But before we let you go, Missy's got one last question that she asked all of our guests, and I'm going to turn it over to her now.
So, Paul, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of our conversation and the work that you do, what is your more to tell?
My more to tell is that what's going on in Ukraine it's one of the few times in international relations where there's a basic right and wrong. Russia invaded Ukraine. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. Russia has abducted children. That's a fact. It's tortured people. It has murdered civilians and continues to do so every single day. It's constantly attacking the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. It's trying to freeze Ukrainians out of their homes. It has soldiers bring Ukrainians in occupied territory to vote for Putin. It forces them to take Russian passports. There's a lot of human rights violations going on here. And I think it's completely valid as an American to say, okay, but that's not my country. It's not necessary. But let's remember who the victims are in this war. It's not a political thing. You can absolutely support your candidate. You can support your foreign policy, but let's remember that these are people who are fighting for the same kind of life that we all have as Americans, just as a right when we're born. And I think, to me, that's one of the most moving and compelling parts of my job, is getting to work with people who are doing so much and putting so much on the line to make their society a better and more just place.
Well said, my friend.
Thank you, Paul.
Paul, thanks again for being our guest this week. We appreciate it. You are welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much, and thanks for giving a platform to this issue.
Missy, talking to Paul was so rewarding. I mean, I learned so much from him, and he was just an inspiration to talk to.
Yes, I have 3 things to say.
Okay.
Very quickly, and then I'll let you take it. 1, I helped raise a brilliant kid.
Wow.
Is all I have to
Did you
say.
pull a muscle patting yourself on the back?
I almost did. I'll take some credit, even though no credit is due.
He's remarkable.
Brilliant and remarkable. Whatever little part I played in that, I'll take credit for. But anyways, that's one thing. The other 2 things are just quotes kept running through my mind as he was talking. And one is from the prophet Fred Rogers.
Oh,
Won't you
Fred.
be, please won't you be,
Oh my gosh.
please won't you be my neighbor.
Oh.
And then the other is from Jesus himself, when he tells the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Oh my gosh.
And I guess it's not his quote, but from the person who asked him, who is my neighbor? And I just kept thinking of that as Paul, mentioned the Ukrainians and how they're feeling right now, and the vulnerability that they're experiencing, having been invaded. And so those are just 2 kind of things, won't you be my neighbor and who is my neighbor, that keep running through my mind on a global stage.
Well, out of those 3 points you made, 2 of those are really good. But I love I mean, obviously the Fred Rogers quote is remarkable, but the analogy and the parallel between what we're experiencing, or more precisely what the Ukrainians are experiencing, and the parable of the Good Samaritan is just spot on. I mean, just absolutely spot on. And when you think about the victim of a robbery that Jesus tells, and who's laying in a ditch, and you have these significant personalities walk by and ignore the victim, because, they were too good, or, they were, somehow above, the fray. But it's the Samaritan. It's the Samaritan who is technically the cultural enemy within the story, provides care and comfort and goes the extra mile to help the victim of violence. Boy, that's damning on us right now.
Well, it is, except that we always cast ourselves in the Samaritan role.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with us as readers of the Bible is that we are miscasting ourselves most of the time in these stories. And we really need to take a really hard look at what our character is.
I love that. And that's such an excellent point. And so as we think about what it means to be a good neighbor, especially in this context, where are we finding ourselves in this story right now? And I think that's an important question to ask. And so appreciate you bringing that up. One of the things that I really gleaned from our conversation with Paul was the long-term ramifications that this policy switch, as we will call it, in the last 45 days, the significance of that shift and the long-term ramifications of that shift. Because, Missy, the reality is we have been living in a post-World War II era where America rose to the challenge. They came to the aid of their allies in Europe and conquered fascism and solidified themselves as a global leader and a protector for any person or country who wants to have a liberal democracy. What we are seeing unfold before our eyes now is the reverse of that. And it is frightening and terrifying for me as a person of faith, as a United States citizen, because what we have seen in the last 40 to 45 days from this particular administration and their withdrawal of support for Ukraine, and it seems like their embrace of Vladimir Putin and the Russian agenda, is this abandonment of countries who are trying to practice democratic values and policies and this embrace of authoritarian rulers. I am really concerned about the long-term ramifications of this for us as a country, because if I'm a European country right now, why would I negotiate with the United States on a trade deal or any kind of deal? Because we're always one election away now from things going sideways. And America's protection for democratic values right now, at this moment, what we are hearing from this administration, it could change, and I pray and hope it changes. But right now, what we're hearing is the exact opposite. And the Europeans are hearing that. The rest of the world is hearing that. And that is terrifying and should concern every American, no matter how they vote or what party they affiliate with. We've got to think about long-term ramifications for this. And so that is where I want to put my energy these days, is trying to rebuild those relationships and hearing from people like Paul who are living in Ukraine, even more so hearing from Ukrainians themselves or Europeans themselves or other places in the world where they're facing autocratic type of governments, and let them know we hear them, we see them. Federal government at this point is not necessarily the same feeling that the American citizens are feeling. We still support Ukraine and want to help them every way we can. And that's what we're trying to do here at Good Faith Media by bringing people like Paul Kroeger onto the podcast.
Right. And I just want to do make a quick plug too. Like you said, we're talking to people who are living there, including Paul, but our senior editor Craig Nash has a great article this week,
yes,
as well as some commentary on his social media about a conversation that he had with a Ukrainian minister,
a Ukrainian chaplain who had been working on the front lines with soldiers who are putting their life on the line, and in many cases, their friends are losing their life because of what's going on in Ukraine.
Right. So definitely check that out as well. We will continue to find and bring stories such as these to let, I feel like just to Express the humanity
Yeah.
Of individuals who are just suffering so and trying to endure this dark time.
Yeah.
And also, I want to just reiterate what Paul mentioned in our interview, that there's a website, U24, it's the numbers 24, u24.gov.ua, where you can donate to Ukraine and select what you would like to give towards. So
absolutely. So check that out. Make certain that you can provide support to them. And just really appreciated everything that Paul had to say. And it was great to have him on the show. Well, Missy, it's come to that time where we need to offer our joys and hopes. And so I'm going to ask you, in light of everything that we've been talking about today, what is bringing you joy this week?
Right. And per usual, I get to bring the joy because I have no hope. So my joy just comes from our conversation today. Just seeing Paul, all grown up and just doing amazing things in the world. It just made me happy. I hate the circumstances in which he's working. I am worried for him, as I'm sure his mama is, his safety, but absolutely wholeheartedly believe in what he's doing. And I'm just so proud to have been a part of his life and to be able to continue to cheer him on and to see all that he's doing. So what brings you hope, Mitch Randall?
I'm having a hard time finding hope this week. I don't want to say I don't have hope, but I'm having a hard time finding it. And that's difficult for me to say because I am
you are an eternal optimist.
I really am. I feel a lot like, since this is the season of Lent, heading towards Holy Week, I feel like I'm existing in Holy Saturday, to be quite honest with you. I feel like I'm stuck between something really bad that has happened that I'm still trying to comprehend, but also understanding that there may be some hope on the horizon, but I'm not certain of it. I'm not sure what's going to happen. And so I really do feel stuck in Holy Saturday, with one eye still reflecting on the Friday experience, but also one eye hoping that Sunday comes. And so that's where I am right now, just to be honest with you.
So I hear you have hope. That's what I hear you say.
I'm searching for hope, Missy. I'm searching for it.
We'll take it.
So yes, a wonderful conversation today. Always good to see Paul. We wish him and his colleagues and also the incredible, remarkable people of Ukraine the very best. We're thinking of them. We're praying for them. We hope that all of this can be resolved in the end, and that peace can come to their country, but peace without compromise. And that's the real difficulty of this situation. So tough. It's been a tough week, but we're going to continue to persist because we'll take the lead from the Ukrainians, because that's what they're doing. They're fighting. They're keeping their heads above water, and they're doing everything they can to preserve their values, and we're going to fight along with them.
Agreed.
Well, Missy and I will be back next week. Until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.